So we'll begin by talking about community agreements. Some of you will remember that we talked about these also in the fall, and model how they can help to create a supportive and inclusive environment and a brave space for conversation. We'll introduce those for setting the stage and then discuss how to use them in the conversation. We will recognize the trauma and re-traumatizing experiences some staff, faculty, and students have been experiencing. We'll quickly remind people about current university policies around free speech, and then we'll plunge into having difficult dialogues, what to be alert to, some ways to de-escalate if things get heated, and a little bit about self-care, and we're going to try to do this in about a half an hour. So you can create a space to have difficult dialogues by first agreeing to employ community agreements. Plunging into sensitive topics without having first agreed how you're actually going to be together is an invitation to conflict. Community agreements are a tool that creates a space that values everyone's voice and values everyone speaking from their own experience, not expecting someone to speak for an entire identity group. It asks that we speak only for ourselves and from our own lived experience, making no assumptions about others, even if they look like us or are from the same country or identity group. They provide a framework to address difficult topics in a way that's equitable, listening to and valuing all voices and viewpoints, whether or not we agree with them. And they're a tool of accountability for everyone across all levels of seniority. Community agreements can be adopted for individual meetings or by teams as a way of creating an ongoing sense of support and collaboration. For our discussion today, we wanted to introduce some fundamentals. We will make I statements. I can speak only from what I know, I think, I feel, I hear, as in, I heard you say, rather than, well, you said, which is an invitation to an argument rather than an opening to discussion. Because I heard you say is usually followed by, well, that's not what I meant, which leads to intent versus impact. Because your intent may have been benign or even supportive, but if the impact was hurtful, offensive, dismissive of my experience and what I was trying to say, then it really doesn't matter what your intent was. Just apologize, because it's not about you who said the thoughtless or unintentionally cruel thing. It's about the person you hurt. One mic means only one person talking at one time, please, which is directly related to practice active listening. This is really important for supporting tricky and fraught conversations. Active listening means don't be sitting there thinking about what you want to say in response, but focus on what's actually being said and not said. And ask yourself, does something need to be said here? And am I the one to say it? Make no assumptions about anything, because people do, even if you think you're not. And then safe versus brave. Comfortable and unchallenged versus uncomfortable and challenged. We cannot guarantee people's safety from unintended hurtful remarks, from ugly images, from painful history. Ones that we'd like to introduce are, we will criticize ideas, not people. It's not about the person, it's about what was said. Ask questions and make sure you're really listening to and hearing the responses. And don't assume we know what others are thinking. We will make mistakes. Also, we want to acknowledge that if and when we cause harm or make a mistake, we hope we can all agree to engage with each other with grace and understanding and not with accusations. Practice empathy. Try to understand what others are saying before stating your own positions or thoughts. Keep confidence. That is, we may share what we learn, but not who we learned it from, not who said what, and not other people's stories. And an important one for a team that includes people in roles of varying seniority, leave your position at the door. In the conversations that we're talking about having, you are a learner too. Be mindful also that if you seem to want to have a conversation about a difficult topic, some more junior colleagues may feel that they need to agree to it, even if they'd rather not. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is set up a space where people can really hear each other and be present for each other and not shut down others or feel like shutting down themselves. A key thing to remember is slow down. When you employ community agreements for teams on an ongoing basis, it's good to periodically remind everyone what they've agreed to, especially if things get heated, and sometimes they even need to be revised. So I know we have a lot of people, but can we get a thumbs up? And if you really object to anything, please unmute yourself and say, I object. Okay, thank you. Sheena?
Right. So a part of this presentation originated from a request for us to develop a workshop on content or trigger warnings. And though that's not what today's session is, we did want to start off with one because we are going to mention some things and some other things may come up while we're talking that may be re-traumatizing for some people here. Some sources indicate that the term trigger warning comes out of the field of psychology and is largely associated with PTSD, wherein a trigger sets off a wide range of behaviors. For example, someone who was in a bad car accident may dissociate or have flashbacks when driving on a highway. People who are war veterans or who survived a natural disaster or who have experienced assault may have a whole separate set of triggers. And some people may know what triggers them, while others may be triggered by seemingly unrelated or more disconnected associations, like an orange patterned rug, something you could have never anticipated. So that's the psychological sense. We're not talking about people being offended. Rather, we're talking about people being re-traumatized. Triggers can be very unpredictable. It can include smells or sounds that recall a past trauma. And even if it's not re-traumatizing, people are experiencing heightened emotions right now. So having said that, we want to alert you that in the next few slides, we're going to use some words around the history of conflict in the Middle East and anti-Jewish and anti-Palestinian oppression that may be painful or emotionally evocative.
The events of the past months have been very hard for folks who might not even have a stated connection to Palestine or Israel. For those who do, it's been acute. For anyone who is Middle Eastern or SWANA, which is an acronym that stands for People of Southwest Asian and North African Descent, this includes Muslims, Christians, Jews, and more, there's been a lot of language that invokes xenophobia in the United States post 9/11. This has affected many people who are not Muslim, but who have been subjected to the same Islamophobic xenophobia and hate speech, such as Sikhs and other groups. For Palestinians and Israelis, major traumas are being evoked. For Palestinians, the Nakba and the memory of violence inflicted by the Israeli army, like the bombings in 2014. For Israelis and for Jews from around the world, the Holocaust and other violent anti-Semitism, such as being reminded of pogroms in Europe and the Middle East. A strong emotional response and re-traumatization can result in feelings of fear, of not being heard, and of feeling like one's humanity is up for debate or even being denied or erased. Simply, fear of being me, fear of walking down the street, of entering a new school building, of being in class because of feeling perhaps targeted and emotionally assaulted. Words and images that might not have elicited much of a response before October 7th are now causing a strong reaction in some. For instance, a group of students created a small poster that included a quote about oppression from Audre Lorde and 2 small images of a Palestinian flag and a slice of watermelon, and tacked it up in a Parsons building, along with several other posters with different quotes from other writers and scholars. My eyes saw nothing of concern. However, some Jewish students felt physically threatened. Some students, staff, faculty are naming what they're feeling as trauma. Some of us are not. Some of us may even feel angry or confused about what others are feeling. Whether or not it is trauma and re-traumatization, whether or not we agree when someone says an image or words are traumatic, threatening, or violent, does not matter. They're still having a strong emotional reaction, and that's what we need to acknowledge. And we still need to respond with compassion. The next slide includes a number of headlines about incidents that have happened on various college campuses in the past months affecting Muslim or Jewish students.
So the headlines on the screen now are just a small sample, but they highlight what's been going on and speak to just how unsafe students, faculty, and staff are feeling, and really how unsafe, disturbed, and alienated students, faculty, and staff are. We know you know this, but we still want to say it out loud. Across the country, there's been a surge in harassment, doxing, and hate crimes targeting Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, Muslim, and Arab populations. And we're seeing this reflected on college campuses. Organizations are being condemned for taking sides, and they're being condemned for staying silent. So now there's an image about social media. It might feel a little familiar. Thanks in large part to social media, we're steeped in the news, right? And there's little or no tolerance for alternative positions or nuanced interpretations. So we're hoping to talk through how you can hold a conversation that actually creates some space for nuance, hearing and listening, and openness to alternative perspectives, or at least perspectives that may diverge from your own. We've been doom scrolling about the conflict, right? This is similar to what we saw earlier in the pandemic and in other recent global crises. Nonstop alerts, headlines, and posts can make us feel even more powerless, defeated, and negative. And all of this connects right on back to stress, depression, anxiety, isolation, and disrupted sleep. And sure, our ancestors, to survive, they needed to be on constant alert for attacks, but the excessive amount of information coming our way is detrimental to our well-being. On top of that, we're receiving hateful comments in response to things we're posting or things others have shared, and this can increase isolation and promote anger, rage, and a sense of defeat. It's worth noting that some of us may even be the ones leaving the hateful comments. Either way, this is leading to more division and making civil dialogue and understanding all the more impossible. There's a lot of conspiracy theories and a whole lot of disinformation. People are resharing information without first questioning it. We might see something someone repost and make assumptions based on that post. Colleagues and students may look at our post or what we've liked and make assumptions about us. According to clinical psychologist Hala Alyan, when misinformation is identity affirming and emotionally charged, we're way more likely to accept it without being critical of it. And then we're more likely to accept beliefs that dominate the social groups we're a part of. Sharing also makes us think we know more than we do. Researchers at the University of Texas at Austin have found that sharing news articles on social media can prompt people to think they know more about the article's topics than they really do. Sharers start to believe that they're knowledgeable about the content they're sharing, even if they haven't read it or even if they've only looked at the headline. To quote, by putting information online, sharers publicly commit to an expert identity. Doing so shapes their sense of self, helping them to feel just as knowledgeable as their post makes them seem. And as much as sharing articles makes us feel like we know it all, it can also make us think that other people know more than they do. And all of this can make it harder for us to admit that we're not experts, or we're still learning, or we're still figuring out how to even talk about what's going on. We might feel pressure to pick a side, to sign a petition, to express outrage, or to take another action so that others know where we stand, so that we aren't accused of indifference or being complicit. But for those of us who aren't informed, we're better off if we slow down, continue to educate ourselves, and resist pressure to align with something we're still figuring out and aren't sure about.
So before embarking on a conversation that may be upsetting, you may want to remind yourself how you can self-regulate should things become emotionally difficult. Our brains are naturally wired to keep us within this middle window of tolerance, but excess stress and anxiety can cause our nervous system to get out of whack and become hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. When you're within your window of tolerance, for the most part, you're able to think more clearly, function more rationally, make decisions without feeling overwhelmed. We all experience things differently. I have a natural tendency to, when I am stressed, to go into the hypo-arousal. I shut down. So think about what works best for you. We will, assuming we have time, we'll share some options, but a really simple one is breathe. Breathe in really thoughtfully and deeply. Hold it for a moment, and then breathe out slowly, slowly, deeply, and repeat. Now we're going to plunge into how to have the conversation. Free speech is constitutionally protected speech. It does not mean you can say anything you want. For example, we all know it's illegal to shout fire indoors. But it is my right to express my views, and I can say something that you may find offensive. Speech is protected, but we are not protected from speech we don't like or find offensive or wrong. It is my right to say it. It is your right to be offended. Now, shortly after October 7th, the deans of NSSR and Lang issued a statement to their faculty about free speech and academic freedom. And this is a line that's really important, quote, "Treating the views of all community members with respect and engagement and exercising free expression with consideration of its impact on others will contribute to a community in which difficult conversations can take place with safety," I would change that to bravery and courage, "and to an environment that promotes free expression to the fullest extent." The phrase "with consideration of its impact on others" is a point worth underscoring. Academic freedom means, in simplified terms, that faculty cannot be punished within their professional domain for saying things administrators or colleagues don't like. And we talked about being brave before and just now. We can't guarantee anyone's emotional safety in difficult conversations, but we can agree to be brave together through these practices. And we will understand if someone needs to disengage, to step away, or leave. As I said, this presentation is drawn from one that we've been offering for faculty. A hard conversation is going to be a hard conversation no matter where it occurs, whether it takes place in a classroom, in a professional context, or in conversation with a student or their parent. There is overlap in setting the stage to center respect, civility, grace, and empathy. Still, it's worth keeping in mind the contexts aren't the same. The power dynamics between supervisors and supervisees, and between and among teammates at work, or between an employee and a student, all differ. We want to recognize that laying the groundwork for a group to sustain such conversations over the course of weeks or months, and engaging in one-time conversation with someone like a student or a parent who is upset, are different endeavors. Your colleagues may have anxieties and fears that are similar to or totally distinct from your own. One person may be afraid to say anything, hyper-aware or at least believing that others who may have done so maybe have lost their jobs. And New York is an at-will employment state. Someone else may fear being ostracized or isolated for holding a minority view. Some may think discussions of politics have no place at work. And someone may be deeply troubled by persistent silence on the part of someone else and read that silence as indifference. Whatever the situation, we want to emphasize focusing on listening and being sure you're listening to understand, not listening just to reply. Ask clarifying questions such as, I'm curious why you think that. Can you say more? When we step into areas of potential conflict, we often find fear. Acknowledging what we might be afraid of and remembering that the people with whom we may disagree likely also have fears, but maybe not the same ones, can push us toward empathy and respect and help us remember that whatever they may believe, they are fundamentally a human being. Now, I'm not going to read these. I'm just going to show them that they're on these slides. We're going to share the slides with you afterwards. But it's important to remind ourselves of how the university is thinking about the words we use. This and the quotation on the next slide are from the university's faculty policies on the free exchange of ideas. And then this paragraph is from the university's statement on free speech and safety on campus. Sophia?
So in addition to community agreements, there are a few ongoing practices you might bring into meetings or just your interactions with others to promote an environment of respect, civility, and curiosity. And this is exactly what we're recommending to faculty. Discuss in advance the question of having a conversation about how people are feeling about the conflict, war, or genocide. And just note all of these words, each one will be troublesome in a different way to different people. Once a discussion is agreed to, be sure that staff can understand they can opt out of attending. An entire meeting can be dedicated to a conversation, or you may allot a certain time period. Consider why you're having the conversation and what you as a team hope to gain from it. Build rapport by making space for colleagues to interact. A warm-up we often use asks participants to share one thing you can't tell about me just by looking at me or hearing me is blank, and it's important for me to tell you that because blank, that exact wording. When people can be vulnerable and really get to connect not only as coworkers, but as people, it's easier to reel a moment of contention back into one of collaboration and discussion. Explain the difference between emotional trauma and upset and intellectual discomfort. The former is harmful, the latter is essential to learning. It means our ideas are being challenged as we struggle to resolve cognitive dissonance. Check in frequently, ask everyone how they are doing and if they need a break. You can say something like, I just want to take a moment to allow everyone to pause. Is everyone feeling like we can proceed? Make room for what isn't being said. There's an activity we share with faculty to help ensure there's a diversity of thought and perspective in the classroom. When implemented in a work environment, it can help challenge groupthink or give voice to what some are thinking but not saying out of fear their comments won't be welcome. It's called the 5-minute practice, and it's a way of taking an invisible or marginalized perspective and entertaining it respectfully for a short period of time. So what you do basically is anyone who feels that a particular viewpoint is being overlooked can point that out and employ this exercise. The team considers the merit of the perspective, and this means not criticizing it and making every effort to believe it for 5 minutes. Then only those who can speak in support of it are allowed to speak. All critics must remain silent. It works for thorny issues, but it also helps people think outside the box in other realms and promotes an environment where an unpopular opinion can be heard. Remind folks that they can excuse themselves or step out for 5 minutes if they need to. And if you're leading a discussion like this, take care of yourself. Stop if you need to and take a break.
So once you've collectively established how and when you're going to have a difficult conversation, prepare yourself, especially if you're going to be the facilitator. There are these are some dynamics to anticipate during the conversation. These are true of discussions around all kinds of sensitive topics like race, economic injustice, gender and gender identity, size, ability, and religion. These are terms drawn from the Difficult Dialogues Project from the Center for Engaged Pedagogy at Barnard. Critique fatigue can arise in situations where, this is particularly true for students, they feel that there's too much emphasis on explaining the patterns and mechanisms of oppression and not enough on developing the tools and skills to actually fight that oppression, especially when it relates to their own experiences. Critique fatigue may compound or be interconnected with high levels of chronic stress, depression, and anxiety that we're all experiencing right now. It takes a particular toll on people of color. So it can be important to help think about what they might actively do to respond to the oppression that they're seeing in a constructive and respectful way. I suspect this is why we're actually seeing an increase in activism around the conflict in the Middle East, because they want to do something. Experienced parasitism occurs when the contributions of one person or small group of people becomes the source of energy that powers the work of the group as a whole, leading others to feed from what they offer and to cease engaging with the issue when their host is absent. Cultural strip mining happens on a group level. The viewpoints and narratives of a single, often marginalized group of people are sought as a learning resource for their peers, but without those peers offering their viewpoints or narratives in return. What makes these dynamics complex is that they often arise from good intentions. A supervisor or a group leader recognizes some member or members as holding authority on a topic and defers to their real or presumed expertise. But they are exploitative in the sense that they put just one person or small group to work for the benefit of all. And most importantly, subjects them to risk-taking and vulnerability that the dominant group is then spared. Be mindful of these kinds of dynamics in your conversations and look to intercede, calling on other voices and experiences, even if you think you have nothing to contribute. If you think you have nothing to contribute, why is that? And what might you bring to the conversation from your own experiencing? Hostile solidarity is a type of belonging. It can manifest when potentially polarizing topics are discussed in a group that has not cultivated a sense of mutual obligation and belonging. In a discussion about the crisis in the Middle East, it could result in some team members with the same ideas about its origins or implications banding together against someone with differing views. In this case, the dominant group unites and even derives pleasure from ostracizing, deriding, or otherwise excluding someone who dissents from what they see as the common sense that has emerged among the dominant group. I know we would never intentionally do these things, but they happen. It's human nature. One way of proactively addressing its emergence is to build understanding and group solidarities that are anchored in collaboration and the understanding and appreciation of differences as opportunities for learning. If you've agreed to have a difficult conversation, hopefully everyone is coming into it with the right spirit, but we're also human and may be experiencing strong emotions. The facilitator needs to be alert to these emerging dynamics. Finally, idle talk doesn't mean chit-chat, but in this context, it means when words become flattened, conventional, and kind of meaningless. For example, DEI. What does it really mean? Really? We actually looked up the word inclusion recently because we thought, we use it all the time, but what does it actually mean? Idle talk is what happens when convention comes to stand in for riskier and more purposeful ways of understanding complex topics. For example, the word anti-racism is being used a lot, but what do we really mean when we say it? One could say the same now about words like Zionist, terrorist, genocide, apartheid. The words become reflexes or habits of speech that can cause us to under-examine what we're actually speaking about or what we are doing with our words. The problem of idle talk in this sense is a problem of presumed consensus and surface level engagement. And that's not unrelated to what Sheena said earlier with our tendency to think that we know things when we share them or read a headline.
So when having difficult conversations, as we said before, it's good to pause periodically and check in with ourselves and each other. So we'll have you take a moment to check in with yourself and think about how you're feeling. How are you feeling, whether it mentally, emotionally, physically?
All right. So if you're in a leadership position, your colleagues are likely going to look to you to be an active facilitator of the hard conversation. And the same can hold true if you're talking one-on-one with a student, parent, or another colleague. In situations where you're not perceived to be the official facilitator, you can still use these techniques I'm going to talk through to help others get through the conversation. Two things that are really important are to try to remain neutral and calm. And as we've been saying, take your time. Your role as a facilitator can include rewording questions or comments, correcting misinformation, providing context, asking for some clarification, reviewing main points that have been made, and perhaps most importantly, modeling temperate discourse and respect. Remember, you do not need to be an expert on the topic to facilitate with compassion and to create an environment of trust. So establish trust in the process by reiterating and reaffirming the community agreements as applicable. Acknowledge the energy in the room and acknowledge that there are strong emotions and positions in a way that humanizes everyone and validates what people are feeling. Ask questions and remain curious and attentive. Encourage others to respond to each other with questions and thoughtfulness, and to take time before speaking to consider what really needs to be said. Embrace silence. In group settings, it can be helpful to offer students or colleagues a minute or two to jot down their thoughts, reactions, and questions. This can be really helpful for those who are feeling emotional or who need to calm down or who just need a moment to process. Ask that everyone try to understand each other's perspectives before they react to them. For instance, you might ask someone to listen carefully to another point of view, ask questions about it, and restate it before they offer their own opinion. And try to refrain from picking sides. Aim to summarize what's been said as objectively and neutrally as you can, taking care to acknowledge the various viewpoints without leaving any out or sounding like you're preferencing one opinion or side over another. And if you're not in a position to do that because of your convictions or how you're managing, acknowledge it. The hope here isn't to change minds as much as it is to clarify the content of the conversation. And finally, check in. Just because everyone looks fine doesn't mean they are. Similarly, someone who is distracted or distant may have something totally unrelated going on. And it's best not to assume how folks are managing and instead to ask them how they're feeling. We often tell faculty they can let students who might not want to share publicly know that they can do so by email or office hours. Paying attention and showing care helps, especially during these heated discussions. So encouraging conversation and discouraging disruption. Good thing to do is to return to those community agreements and the importance of them. Draw attention to specific agreements that resonate with the moment. If you don't have any, or if you're in a one-on-one conversation, you might consider borrowing community agreement language. For example, I don't want to assume what you meant by X. Could you provide more context? Encourage others to share what they're feeling and thinking, and validate those who take these brave positions to encourage others to do likewise and to acknowledge that it's not easy. This can be as simple as saying, I know it's not easy to talk about this, and I really appreciate your willingness. If someone tries to dominate the conversation, call attention to it and state that you want to ensure that there's time and space for others to contribute. In a one-on-one conversation, you might say, I realize I said a lot. Do you have questions or a direction you hope to steer us in? Or if you're being talked over, it's been helpful to hear your perspective, but I would like to add that blah, blah, blah. It can be frustrating when someone takes up a lot of space. I know I'm way better. It's easier for me to manage my frustration when I remember that there's a lot of reasons for this. Some people who take up a lot of space might be completely oblivious to the impact they're having. One person may have a lot of knowledge about the topics at hand. Another may be excited or nervous, or another may feel that they actually know more and better than others. Pay attention. Not being heard or being ignored increases frustration and hostility. Address and challenge insensitive and marginalizing remarks. You can do so by asking who such comments isolate or devalue. As we've said, you'll want to focus on the remark and what's offensive about it, not the individual who said it. And extend some grace. The person you're talking with simply may not have the tools that others have. If things get too tense, pause. Right? You might need to pause or stop the conversation. And you might say something along the lines of, we really need to take a breather before we continue. When issues arise, it's really good practice to document them, to keep track of what's happening. And we hope it won't come to this, but having that personal record in as concrete terms as possible will be helpful if you do need to work with other colleagues or offices to address the matter.
So I'm mindful that we only have 2 minutes left. So we want to get to at least a couple of methods for de-escalation. These can be deployed if you're facilitating the conversation or if you're a participant. One isn't better than the other, depending on what's happening, what's going on. Dealing with the situation is better than just trying to move past it or pretend nothing is happening. So this first one is the simplest and easiest. Ask for a pause. Then recap or reframe what you heard from an I perspective. I heard you saying, is that what you meant? Or ask questions like, when I hear these words, I think the person means blank. Is that what you meant? What were you thinking would be the effect of your words? That's a really good one for faculty. What were you trying to say and why? Assuming whatever was said was unintentionally hurtful, perhaps remind everyone about the intent versus impact in your agreements. And then here's another one similar. If things have taken a really bad turn, you might actually want to take a 5-minute or a couple of minute break. That gives you, if you're the facilitator, time to check in with individual staff members and even speak privately with the ones who were escalating things. Then when you return, summarize what happened, again, using the I language. Next, and this is valuable for teams, ask everyone to reflect in writing on how they were feeling during the previous discussion and why that might be. Then ask them to come up with suggestions for how the discussion might have gone differently. The idea is to move staff members out of the content of the discussion and into consideration of the practice of the discussion and the dynamics that were play, and to come up with different ways of proceeding. Review your community agreements, ask for a reaffirmation, or does anything need to be changed? And then when everyone is ready, resume the conversation. And we'll stop there because we know we're at time.